Okay, so we're going to look at The Horse and His Boy for no reason other than that in this volume that I've been using and recommended to you that it's the third in the series, but actually it's the fifth one published. So just I'm aware of that and the genesis of the series, and I'm just jumping around in that sense. So we did The Magician's Nephew as the first in the series because chronologically it needs to be there, even though he wrote it as the penultimate one. But he didn't begin it as the penultimate one, as the sixth in the series. He began it shortly after he wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So The Magician's Nephew, he started on it, then stopped doing it and set it aside for a time, and then moved on to the next one, and so forth. So and that's, I don't know if that's important or not, just to be aware of it. But the beginning of the story is really the bounding of a lion into the midst of the story, and everything that comes with that. Because everything that comes with that, Lewis is to some degree, and this is what he says in terms of the composition, he doesn't actually have, and this is what to some degree a grand theory like that of what's his name with the wants to connect the 7 planets and with the genesis of the 7 Narnia Chronicles. It sounds like it's planned out, and that Lewis is going to construct his fiction in accordance with the 7 planets, and therefore of course he knows what's going to happen and when, and that's the broad structure of it. And I don't think that that's the case. That if you read Lewis's fiction and how it comes about, and even in the order in which it comes about, it's less evident that's the case. And it's also less evident in the very first of the stories that the influence of the planet is the big thing. I think he brings that in, and as he goes along, he wants to add a structure and a sort of a linking structure to cosmology in the whole narrative. He thinks it's very important that he does so, and he does add it, but it gets more influence as it carries on, not so much early on. And he doesn't even know exactly how the first installment, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, is going to relate to the later books. As I say, he realizes I have to give a background story to where Aslan came from, where the lamppost in the middle of that other world, where did that come from? Where did this narrative of the fulfilled prophecy of the 4 children to become kings and queens of Narnia and defeat the White Witch, where did that come from? There's a backstory. In the same way we find in Tolkien's fiction that often the writers or the figures in his accounts are speaking of old legendary stories that they all know about, and he has not yet written those legends. And he'll continue to work on them. And the best known of them is the Silmarillion. And that's probably something like the equivalent of The Magician's Nephew, something like that. It gives the creation account. And so does Lewis. So he's aware of the need to do that, at least at some level, in terms of the creative integrity of the whole enterprise. He wants to give that completed picture, and concludes with the last battle then. But it begins with the lion, and the lion, to some degree, writes his own story. And Lewis is not aware of what the lion and then the bizarre leprechaun or faun with the umbrella has to do with it, and why there's a witch, and why the witch is on a sledge, and why it's snowfall. Why are these all necessary to the story? What does it have to do with the Christian allegory? And the answer, it has nothing to do with the Christian allegory at the outset. He starts with the story as an image of his mind of a lion, which he's had ever since a young boyhood. And by reading great works of literature and loving the literature that he's read and deeply imbibing those stories in his own imaginative world, they start to come out for him. And he most closely resembles 2 writers that are not given a great deal of attention by Christians these days. Edmund Spencer, for one, and Sir Philip Sidney on the other. These are Christian Renaissance writers in the Elizabethan period, and they write what we're going to call fairy. Now, I'm going to say a bit about this, but I'm going to do the Horse and His Boy. But I wanted to, at this point in the course, since I've been gifted an extra lecture, to do something with it besides just exposit the Horse and His Boy, because I think I want to say something about Lewis and his use of explicit Christian story in his fiction, which some have said destroys its integrity. And it doesn't follow the pattern of Tolkien, for example. Tolkien keeps them separate. But Lewis follows the pattern, and it's a much older pattern, I will say, than that of Tolkien. Tolkien, although he's the medievalist, does not follow the development of the medieval Christian tradition in its particularly in its expression of fairy by those two writers I just mentioned, Spencer and Sidney. They will make the Christian story pop out, emerge from the context of their stories about the pagan world. And they're unashamed of it, and so is Lewis. So if we say that Lewis is overstating it, or he's involving himself too much as a Christian in the story, and he removes something of the fictive element and the delight in it, I think we need to realize that Lewis is on better grounds, at least if we revere those Elizabethan writers, which I do, and which Tolkien would have to some degree as well. He just has a different approach to it. So let me say something about that. Lewis writes in a letter that some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children. So I'm a Christian, I'm an apologist. How am I going to say and reduce the Christian story to a child's ability to apprehend it? Some people think that that's how I approach it. Then, fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology and decided what age group I'd write for, then drop a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out, quote, allegories to embody them. This is pure moonshine, says Lewis. I couldn't write in that way at all. But this is the way Christians will actually understand what Lewis is doing. He's writing Christian truths for children, and therefore what he's doing is effectively only continuing the apologetic endeavor. And he's just applying the apologetic to small children now. But he starts with, what's my agenda, and what's my demographic, and how do I write for them and present Christian truths to them? He says that was never my intention. I don't think that way. I can't write that way. Or perhaps he could have written that way, but he realized it would have been a very bad mistake and the writing would have been terrible then. And if you read Christian fiction writers who try to do exactly what he just described there, the results are almost always terrible. It's forced, it's bad, it's badly written. You can see what they're trying to do on a Christian front. As fiction, it totally fails. The children don't like it either. So it fails at the most important end. It has no apologetic effect. Nobody loves the characters or wants to read the books. So what he does, rather, is he trusts the images that have come into his mind and where they're going to lead. And to some degree, one of his great biographers, whose name evades me just for a second, it's called The Narnian. Really good biography from a literary point of view. Is sensitive to his literary capacities. Alan Jacobs, it is, The Narnian. Sensitive to his literary abilities and also to his Christianity. He's not disparaging of it or dismiss it like A.N. Wilson is. He observes that these images have formed him as a Christian in a particular way. And he doesn't want to reject them or think that they could be discarded. There's something important about the images that come to his mind. And he's not following the marketing program or agenda of publishers. What do children really want? And then let me write things to give them what they want. as if he were, a marketing agency. That's not his concern. It wasn't Lewis's or Tolkien's concern. They had no interest in mass appeal. If they were interested in mass appeal, they would not have appealed to the masses. So there's the interesting thing about it. When you are driving and asking the wrong questions, you will get bad outcomes in almost anything. But if you go after what's good and true and beautiful and what genuinely moves you and are dedicated to that ideal, rather extraordinarily, it appeals to everyone. So pragmatism has to be dispensed with as a motivation for doing good, true, beautiful, just things. It has to be dispensed with. If it is good, true, beautiful, just, etc., it will be extraordinarily pragmatic and practical. It will be. But if you're going after utility, you will create something useless. So there's the paradox. He doesn't even ask the question of the apologist, what do children best need? Like they need the truth. He doesn't even ask those questions at all. And where he does and involves himself in the story as an apologist and he can't stop himself, that's where his fiction falls down. That's what Spencer and Sidney don't do. They don't come in as an apologist and feel the need to explain the implications of the fictional account that they're reading there. And Lewis does that sometimes. He steps in and provides the narrative explanation almost from the outside in the same way that I'm doing. I think it's acceptable for me to do so. It's not good storytelling for you to explain to the reader the significance of what's just happened. That's for a commentary. That's for Lewis commenting on other writers, not Lewis as the writer. And he sometimes has trouble keeping them separate. That's his failing. In a sense, he's too gifted, too talented in too many areas, and he can't keep them entirely separate. But insofar as Narnia succeeds, and it does, it's because he is no longer writing apologetics. So I'm going to deviate from the A.N. Wilson account, whereby, again, a biographer who says that after he got bested by Elizabeth Anscombe, he retreated to fictional fantasy realms of make-believe, just like Christianity was. So he retreated and went into a wardrobe himself and nursed his wounds and licked whatever Freudian wounds that psychologically he had and expressed those for several years and so forth, but had nothing more to do with apologetics. As we know, that's not true because he went back to works of apologetics and wrote them. But there was an itch that he had that needed to be scratched, which his friend Tolkien was already fully invested in, of fictional world creation, sub-creation. They were both so interested in this. This is the primary thing that I would say distinguishes Lewis, is that commitment to sub-creation. That's what makes him a good literary critic. He's aware of the fictional impulse and how important it is, and he traces it in other ages. The background here, here's what you need to know. So he's really good at that. He's a better literary critic than Tolkien, and Tolkien's not a bad critic at all. He's in fact very good, but Lewis is better. And then he's the apologist. Well, the apologetics, I don't think he didn't go after apologetics. That came to him. He was asked to speak on these topics during the Second World War. And so he was pulled into an arena because of his ability to engage with audiences that aren't Christian and do it on a national front. And he agreed to do it. And he's very good at it. Some people think he's the best Christian apologist. Maybe he is. But here we're looking at him as fiction, and I just want to debunk the idea that he is still engaging in apologetics here, or that we should read him that way, or that his whole value is in extracting whatever apologetics we can get from the novels. If we do that, then I think we do him a disservice as a writer of fiction and don't really appreciate the stories as stories. So that is my little soapbox at the beginning. But he says that the moral intent in them will arise from whatever spiritual roots you've succeeded in striking during the whole course of your life. And Lewis has read these sorts of stories his whole life. What sort of stories? The technical term in the academy are romances. And in the medieval period, they write romances over and over and over. It's a dominant genre, not the epic, not the tragedy, the romance. It's an episodic engagement with a supernatural realm that's breaking in on the natural realm. They talk about it all the time. As I say, Spencer is the chief practitioner of this, the fairy queen. Christian truths in a pagan framework being expressed in a very Christian fashion. Lewis is happy to do that. Nowadays, we don't call them romances, we call them fairy tales or fantasies. But note that fairy tales, well, that sense of what a fairy tale is needs to be corrected by Tolkien. So he writes a essay that I'll deal with next semester when we look at Tolkien and Lewis science fiction and subcreation on fairy stories, and he will engage with our misconception of what a fairy story is, but really what he's engaging in is what the genre of romance is. And it's been fairy stories in our day have deviated from it. They've moved away from the Christian content, and they've to some degree neutered the fairies. They've made them small, and they've made them ineffectual, they've made them sort of make-believe, they've made them no longer terrifying. That's all gone in modern fairy stories. And it's a genre that's written only for children, consumed by children of interest only to undeveloped, immature minds. That's what we associate with fairy stories or fantasies. But it's the most interesting genre of the 20th century, although not taken very seriously, what we call speculative fiction or science fiction. It's the one that keeps capturing people's interest, and I think it is because it's still in the realm of romance. And some of them now have departed from the Christian features of that, and we know all about those sorts of books like Dune and Game of Thrones and all that sort of thing. But let me not get into that, because I'll start ranting about Game of Thrones and how awful it is. But in his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien makes a point that Lewis quotes over and over. And this is the point, and I'm going to read it here. I say it's a lengthy essay, but this is just an extract. He says, "The association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history, our English domestic history. Fairy stories have in the modern lettered world been relegated to the nursery, as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because the adults do not want it and do not mind if it is misused. It is not the choice of the children which decides this. Children as a class, except in a common lack of experience, they are not one, neither like fairy stories more nor understand them better than adults do, and no more than they like many other things. Fairy stories banished in this way, cut off from full adult art, would in the end be ruined. Indeed, insofar as they have been so banished, they have been ruined." So fairy stories that are cut off from adult interest are of no interest. They're just nonsense, make-believe, what we call fiction. Now, note the way in which we, to this day, in bookstores, in the academy, will praise nonfiction as opposed to fiction. And it's because of this same dynamic. Because nonfiction is for children, or fiction is for children, and nonfiction is for the adults. When they start thinking seriously, then they dispense with the idea of the romance and the supernatural being a part of the way in which we see things. The God element, right? So that's the realm of fiction, and we can relegate that to something of subjective importance and really of insignificance. It's childish. Fiction is a childish endeavor. If that's what we think of it, then the fiction becomes literally useless, and if writers write in accordance with that belief. And furthermore, then they don't think that they're involved in teaching or delighting, which is what every fictional writer historically would always have understood, that they have a duty to teach their audience, not just to delight them, but to teach them. It's a moral imperative of all fiction. And there's no way of avoiding it. If you're not teaching them truths, then you're effectively teaching them falsehoods. That put it even more strongly. If you're not educating them in the way of goodness, you're actually inoculating them to the ways of wickedness. It's creeping into the narrative. So, as I say, the most important writer, and the one that he writes about as a scholar very frequently, is Edmund Spenser and his The Faerie Queene. There's a book on Spenser that I commend to you. It's very good and not much read because Spenser's not much read. But he is the one that creates the whole realm that we want to call fairy, F-A-E-R-Y. Tolkien gives it an I-E rather than that because he wants to talk about something specific to his personal interest. But that realm of fairy is there in the English literary imagination, chiefly through Edmund Spenser, who Milton revered, by the way. And the Romantics revered, actually, Spenser. As I say, very little read. And Lewis also adores Arcadia, which is a pastoral romance written by Sir Philip Sidney. And he sees both men, but especially Sir Philip Sidney, as having an imaginative mind like his own. He's just not willing to say it because it sounds rather immodest. And it probably is. It sounds rather prideful and arrogant, but I think he has that same sort of imagination as Sir Philip Sidney. When he describes Arcadia, Lewis writes this: theoretically, we are all pagans in Arcadia. Remember, Arcadia, remember if you don't know, Arcadia is also dedicated to Elizabeth. And this realm of Arcadia it's a bit like the Faerie Queene. It's dedicated again to Elizabeth, but also the Christian allegories as they play out in the political contemporary sphere. They're writing it on multiple levels. They're seeing the Christian significance of the political, courtly stuff going on in the realm in the midst of the late 16th century. He says, theoretically, we're all pagans in Arcadia. Nevertheless, Christian theology is always breaking in. So even if we have a pagan account, Christian theology keeps on breaking in. And it does with Lewis's fiction as well. And some people think that this is a deficiency of Lewis. And he would say, I suspect, and I will agree with him on this, it's not a deficiency. It's the mainstream of the English literary tradition for Christian themes to break in to the pagan narrative, even if we're going to present it that way. Now, interestingly, and I'm not going to go down this path either, Milton originally thinks about writing about King Arthur and his knights. When he conceives of writing an epic, he thinks about writing about King Arthur. He dispenses with that. In the end, he dispenses with allegory altogether, doesn't go down Spenser's route, and writes something like a realistic portrait of the account of the fall. And when I say realistic, he presents it in an epic form. He decides he's going to write an epic. And he follows the conventions of the epic established by Homer and by Virgil. Begins in medias res with the fall of Satan from heaven. We meet him on the lake of fire in hell, and we don't get to the account of how he got to be there till we find about the war in heaven in books 5 and 6. So it begins in the middle of things. Anyway. So he departs from that, but he considers it because he reveres Spenser and knows how important what Spenser is doing. Milton, to some degree, by breaking from that, may have damaged the Christian tradition that Spenser and Sidney had established, which we see even in John Bunyan's work, Pilgrim's Progress, where it's more conspicuously Christian than we would have had in Spenser or Sidney. And it's less potent as fiction, I would say, although it's not useless by any means. But he says, but Lewis says that this breaking in of Christian theology is not a flaw at all. And Tolkien disagrees. So there's the disagreement between the two. He thinks that the Christian elements don't fit that sub-created world, and so you could keep them out. You're mixing things together that should not be mixed. So Tolkien's a sort of purist. He's not going to allow that. Although when we look at Tolkien's work, we're going to find that there's a lot more Christian framework there than is commonly acknowledged. But it's not overt, right? There's no God in the Lord of the Rings. There's no priest. There's no church. There are no articles of faith. Christ does not enter into the realm at all. There's nothing explicitly Christian there at all, or even implicitly that would suggest something in the way that Lewis is writing. Whereas Lewis, when he writes the Chronicles of Narnia, specifically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, some people think it's just allegory. And it's apologetic allegory at that. And he says, no, you're thinking of it the wrong way. I am not trying to take moral teaching and present it to children in a fictional form using allegory. That's not what I'm doing. It doesn't work that way. So Tolkien writes, myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary real world. And in our real world, Christianity is the known form. So it must not present it in the real known form, according to Tolkien. It must not do that. So he has almost an allergic reaction to presenting Christian truth, even though he's a committed Christian in every aspect of his being. He thinks it's inappropriate for the fiction. Lewis, who is a Renaissance scholar, and not only that, a Protestant, is very happy for the explicit nature of Christian truth to be presented in the fiction. He sees it in his forebears, Spencer and Sidney. And he's very happy. And Milton will do it even more strongly. Now the Christianity needs to be brought to the forefront in a way that will soar above the Aeonian Mount. Right? So note perhaps this is the divide between the Catholic imagination and the Protestant. I don't know if I want to go so far, but I note the continuity there. But Lewis's approach is very different than Tolkien's, and Tolkien thinks that all subcreation demands that the real world and the imaginary world of fairy be kept completely separate. Totally. So he hates when Aslan appears very clearly to be a Christ figure that's killed, crucified, the table of law broken, he is resurrected all, and then he hates that. It's too explicit. That's the known world. That's the real world we inhabit. You need to keep it in the realm of non-reality. You have to keep it there for it to be good fiction. I'm just saying that I am with Lewis on this. And that doesn't mean that I think Lewis is a better writer. But there's a deeper Christian inheritance to this. Yes?
Yeah, part of Tolkien's issue as well be in addition to these very explicit images, but the large issue is the connecting point that Lewis brings to the real world very much so, in that his characters derive from the same world as our own, and they go into this fictional world and such, right? And then these images that are here are very explicitly Christian, then become like they connect to our world and are very much more explicit than any of the other fictions. As like I wouldn't compare it to myself, but like other fiction stuff, they remain in their world, right? They don't come into our own as much, except they teach us about things. Whereas Lewis is being much more direct about how to connect the dots.
Tolkien actually follows the academy in separating religious truth from the real world. And I think this is a grievous error. He actually follows the Enlightenment in separating and saying they have no place. Remember, theology was the queen of the sciences in the Middle Ages. It was even before the Reformation. Theology is the queen of the sciences. Theology has no say in Tolkien's fiction. It doesn't speak at all. It's in the background. He's accepted in a way, and conceded, I think, ground that he should not concede. That's my belief on this. And it's a very odd feature. A man who's so convicted of the Catholic faith, which he is, that he is not willing to allow his Catholic belief to come into his fiction. but he's committed as a writer, as having a certain integrity, that the real world and the imaginary world, never the two shall meet. And yet you can read his work as a Christian and understand it and interpret it that way, but it's not within the story itself. But the interpretation is, he's going to say, oh yes, you have to see it that way. And the Christian take on the Lord of the Rings, yes, that's the correct thing. Down to the dating of when the ring is destroyed. Like, it has a very specific date in Christian history. Good Friday. That's when the ring is destroyed. I'll get to that next minute. So it's very important. So the interpretation is thoroughly Christian. That is the right reading of it, but it's not there in the fiction. So there's the ground of disagreement there. Yes?
I'd say that Lewis and Tolkien are more like, as opposed to I agree they disagree on how to write fiction, but I think they're both trying to do more or less
the same thing. Oh, yes, they are.
The same thing?
Yes.
Even though Tolkien doesn't put religion specifically in his work, he still has the whole Tao and the whole ancient.
Of course.
The roots of religion are so prominent in his work that to me they do the same.
So much so, I'm not diminishing Tolkien as a Christian writer. I think he is a thoroughly Christian writer, and there are certain figures that seem to represent Christ very clearly. In fact, different figures. You have the prophetic figure of Gandalf, you have the priestly figure of Frodo, and then you have the king Aragorn. All three are Christ figures. Yeah, whatever that is. We could get on Tom Bombadil as well, but so these are clearly, in their threefold natures, separated presentations all together present something of the picture of Christ there in his fiction, right? But yes. Paths, and they have a different role and a different responsibility. Yeah, so.
Yeah, because Lewis thinks I would like to portray Christian truth by weaving Christian themes into my fiction. Tolkien goes, I want to go deeper than an acknowledged truth.
Yeah, then it's just a question of whether he goes deeper. So Lewis's argument, and this is the argument that he makes, and I'm with him because I'm a Protestant, is a typological way of reading the scriptures even. The language that is used in the New Testament is a clearer, fuller, and final account of how we are to interpret language and myth. And he says that it's a language more adequate than any language we could come up with as fictional writers. And what is the language? It's actually not language at all. It's this what we might call the symbols, the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. That's the more adequate language of understanding these truths. And so we can't keep them out of the account because that's the best language. It can't be replaced by a writer. You have to put those into your stories. It's implicit in all the mythological stories they love, including the death of Balder and his rising to life. It's there. It's there in the stories of going down to the underworld and coming up. It's there, going to the paths of the dead, like Aragorn does. It's there, but it has to be more explicit because the language is better. And once that's happened, you can't go back anachronistically and present a pre-Christian world in a way that is plausible. We need to use Christian language then, explicitly Christian language where it is warranted, and it is warranted at certain places. So he's saying as a fiction writer, he's not saying it as an apologist. The Christian truth needs to be explicit because it is explicit and it's transformative and it must be explicit. You can't change a culture by insinuating or hinting at things that you're not willing to be explicit about. Tolkien is. People love the books. Is he a better writer of fiction? On one level, probably. On another level, the level that is of most interest to Lewis, in accordance with the Christian tradition, no, he isn't. And where Lewis lets him down is when the apologist comes in and speaks in his stories and interprets to us the authorial, the author's voice intrudes and sort of explains things a bit. That's like, should have kept that out. That was not necessary. You couldn't help yourself there. Tolkien would never do that because he's so rigorous in his wanting to keep his own convictions out of the story because he wants to keep the story real. So anyway, so there are aesthetic issues, there are theological issues at stake. We need to know that, and simply, and this is what I want to say before we go to the horse and his boy, that Lewis is following the model of Spencer and Sidney in presenting the Christian imagination. That's important. This is a course on Lewis. He is to be compared to Tolkien. We will do that next semester, looking at science fiction and subcreation, fantasy literature. But he is doing something, he's striking a different path. And it's not his own path, it's the path that's already been laid down before him in the Renaissance literature, which is a part of his interests. Remember, he's the professor of medieval and Renaissance literature. That's the chair that's created for him at Cambridge University. It's discovering, but it's also biographical. It's the story of how he came to be a Christian. Remember, he did have the walk with Hugo Dyson in the woods, or the Addison's Walk and Tolkien. But that he didn't become a Christian on the spot. That removed an intellectual impediment, but it made him question his own story, and then he writes that in Surprised by Joy. There was something there awoken in him as a child, that the ember of which was never snuffed out. It was covered over by ash. And these men blew away the ash, and then what was there came out. But it wasn't because of a rational piece by piece. It's because Christ then came to him and he started walking. And he could never explain it, but it was deeply embedded within him. So and there's an analogy here in The Horse and His Boy